We've been looking at the saints-only doctrine. These brethren believe that we can only help those who are saints out of the church treasury. And that if the congregation out of the church treasury should help someone who is not a Christian, who is a non-saint, then they sin in doing so, and those individuals in that congregation is hell-bound. This view is best illustrated by the debate proposition that A.C. Grider in his debate with W.L. Toddy affirmed that the Bible teaches that it is a sin for the church to take money from the church treasury to buy food for needy, destitute children, and those who do so will go to hell. Now that was his debate proposition, which he affirmed. We looked at their primary arguments, basically that all of the examples in the New Testament are giving aid to saints. And thus, because there's no example of giving to non-saints, it is thus a sin. Of course, that is an improper use of examples, and even a lack of understanding that our authority does not only reside in examples, direct statements and implications also. Their second argument would be dealing with fellowship, that it would place the church in fellowship with non-saints, and thus it would be sinful. But they would say that an individual can do it. Would that not then place the individual in that same fellowship with a non-saint? If not, why wouldn't it? There are three major passages that are discussed in dealing with this subject. The first of those is 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 13, which tells us, while by the experiment of this ministration they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men. And their position on this is that unto all, or unto all men, always in some ways has reference to only Christians. Whether it refers to, as some would say, to saints, others saying that it is a statement that says unto them, and then all men refers back to unto them, and others would say that unto them is Jewish Christians, and unto all men being other Christians. But in reality, did the saints in the practice of their Christianity render aid only to fellow saints, or did they, as opportunity, resources, priorities occasion, give aid to any who had not obeyed the gospel? Then Galatians 6 and verse 10, as we therefore have opportunity to do good, let us do good unto all men, especially those who are the household of faith. Their position that they must take upon this is that this is individual action only, and that the church cannot do this. In fact, the church sins if it should do good unto all men, especially them of the household of faith. Then James 1 and verse 27, that pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world. Again, they hold this verse as being individual action only. In fact, Eugene Britnell, in his debate with Guy N. Woods, affirmed that the Scriptures teach that it is sinful for pure and undefiled religion to be done by the church in caring for widows and orphans in an organization such as Mount Dora or like facilities when properly supervised by Christians. sinful for the church to practice pure and undefiled religion. But in reality, it incorporates both individual and corporate action, as the rest of the chapter does, as we noted at that time. We then studied in detail this phrase, unto all, in Galatians 6:10 and 2 Corinthians 9:13. It is found 88 times, the Greek word unto all, in 84 verses in the New Testament. Yet no one would argue that it refers to saints in every place. Gus Nichols pointed out that the Greek word pontos, when used apart from some other word meaning man, is translated all men 11 times in the New Testament and does not mean saints only a single time. We also looked at the words that modify it and went through every passage in the New Testament in relationship to those words that modify it. But to be consistent, they must argue that every occasion of unto all means saints only, to be consistent with their view. Not saying that they are consistent, though. Then we started looking at some arguments, implications, and questions. And we looked last week at the collective obligation idea. It is a straw man argument when put forth as the church can do anything the individual can do. Well, no one believes that. Yet it is set forth as that's the position that we take, that the church can do anything the individual can do. No one believes that. But in reality, do obligations to the individual and obligations to the church ever overlap? That is, well, the saints only position is that they can never overlap. In other words, no command that is given to an individual could ever be accomplished by the church. No command that's given to the church could ever be accomplished by the individual without sin. But in reality, there are obligations that overlap, that are given both to the individual and to the church. The way in which we determine such is that all God-given obligations that exist upon the basis of one's being a Christian and that are equally related to all Christians are obligations that apply to both the individual Christian and the local church. Early in the series of lessons, I made mention of the treasury. And to be thinking, what is the treasury? Because I knew this point I was going to be getting to this point. It's an important question, and one that, in reality, those who hold the saints-only position, I've discussed it with several, I've not had one of them answer what the treasury consists of. Does the treasury consist of both liquid and non-liquid assets? Liquid assets, basically cash. Pull out your wallet or billfold and pull out cash. That's a liquid asset, something that you have. It can also, and they are, and from this standpoint, things that can quickly be turned into cash without losing its value. In other words, if I can sell a piece of stock out here and thus have that money immediately available, then that would still be considered a liquid asset. Non-liquid assets, on the other hand, are other items of value. This building, for example, your house is a non-liquid asset. In order to sell this building and property, it would take a long period of time. You could not have immediate access to the cash that you would gain by the sale of the building. And so it's not an immediate asset in relationship to cash or to money. There's other items likened to that. Your car would be the same aspect. Non-liquid assets. Now then, when we come to this question, what is the treasury? Does the treasury consist of only liquid assets, or does it consist of both liquid and non-liquid assets? Now then, I think one of the reasons that you'd see individuals shying away from this subject that hold the saints-only position is it puts them on a horn of dilemma. If they argue that the treasury consists only of liquid assets, then it would be permissible to take money out of the church treasury, a liquid asset, to go and buy a non-liquid asset, and then, since that non-liquid asset is not a part of the church treasury, the church then could then give it to someone who is a non-saint, because it's no longer a liquid asset. So, as an illustration, the church, someone comes in, needs food. Church can go buy the food, give that food to that non-saint, because that food is no longer a liquid asset, is now a non-liquid asset, and that would be permissible. That's if the treasury consists only of liquid assets. The church could, out of its church treasury, pay for utilities, house rent, other items such as that for the non-saint, because all of those are non-liquid assets. But of course, they're not going to accept that idea, and so they've got to accept, well, the church treasury consists of both liquid and non-liquid assets. But there again, we start running into some problems. Just think of some of the things that are bought with money out of the church treasury, and thus have now become non-liquid assets. This building is a non-liquid asset. Since they now will admit that it is non-liquid assets are part of the church treasury, then no non-saint can enjoy the benefits of this building. This building is cooled during the summer, heated during the winter with a heating air conditioning system. If that is a non-liquid asset, and yes, some of us think it's too cold during the summer and too hot during the winter, and others think it's the opposite way. But could the non-saint then benefit from that heating air conditioning system? If the non-liquid asset now is part of the church treasury, they cannot. The pews that every one of you are sitting in are non-liquid assets of the church. Now, if it's part of the church treasury, can a non-saint sit in our pews? We have a water fountain in the foyer. We also have one in the classroom area. That water fountain is a non-liquid asset that is paid for with liquid assets, and we provide water for it, which again, non-liquid asset. Can they drink out of that water fountain? The utilities, the power, the water, the sewer, all of those things are non-liquid assets, but Can they enjoy any of those? Can they use the restroom? That restroom that is in this building is a non-liquid asset. The property that this building sits on is a non-liquid asset. Do we need to put signs out on all points of the property line saying no non-Christian can walk on this property? If they walk across it, are they not benefiting from that non-liquid asset? Do non-saints, and remember, a baby, small children are not saints. Do they have the right to benefit from these non-liquid assets? And in reality, all of these things that I've mentioned become questions that they must answer. Do they have the right to sit in the pews? Do they have the right to benefit from heating and air conditioning? The lighting. We paid for new lights to be put in. It's a non-liquid asset. The restroom facilities, the water fountain. Or does a Christian mother who has a small baby have the right to use the nursery for that small baby who is a non-saint? And on we could ask questions. Do they have the right to use the songbook while we're singing? The songbooks are a non-liquid asset. If non-liquid assets are part of the church treasury and you cannot give aid from the church treasury to a non-saint, how can you allow them to use the songbook? Y'all are looking, at times at least, at that television that has the PowerPoint on it. Should we, if a non-saint comes in here and sits on those non-liquid assets called pews, tell them, now when the PowerPoint comes on, you have to close your eyes because it might benefit you and you're a non-saint? Or do we even allow them on the property? That's why this is an important question. Does the treasury of the church consist of both liquid and non-liquid assets? But here's another question. Do we not do good, that's benevolence, to someone when we teach them the gospel of Jesus Christ to be saved, that individual being a non-saint? Is the church, by using its facilities, by using the things which the church possesses, doing good to that non-saint, being benevolent toward them in the presentation of the gospel of Jesus Christ? When we put our videos, for example, on our website, we put them on Facebook, I put them on my YouTube page, or is the church then being benevolent toward non-saints by the preaching of the gospel to them? Of course it is. But here's another question in relationship to the treasury. Do they put their money in a bank? Banks loan money. Guess where that money comes from? It comes from the deposits that are made by its members. And there's a formula and there's additions to that, but basically it comes as a result of that. Banks oftentimes loan money for things that are contrary to the gospel, even for sinful things. By putting the money, their assets in the bank, are they committing sin? Because now then other people who are not Christians and even engaging in sinful activities many times are benefiting from the money that they have deposited in that bank? If not, why not? Now then, God's nature. I think this is an important point in this whole subject, and I think many times one that gets overlooked. We are to be partakers of God's nature. 2 Peter 1 and verse 4, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Now, yes, I realize in the next passage we'll look at that sometimes they will argue that this is individual action. But we'll notice that in a second. So you can just kind of hold that in abeyance for a few minutes. In Matthew the 5th chapter, verses 43 through verse 48, Jesus in this Sermon on the Mount says, that ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. This teaches us very clearly that God blesses both the just and the unjust by sending rain and sunshine upon each. The just would be those who would be equivalent to the saints, and the unjust the unjust would be those who would be be equivalent to the non-saint. God sends his blessings upon both. Jesus in this teaches us to be perfect in the same way that his Father is perfect. The context being, God sends his blessings upon both the saint and the non-saint, the just and the unjust. You do the same. Now, as I say, some will argue, well, this is dealing with the individual, not the church. Well, we've already dealt with in previous lessons this type of an idea. But let's ask the question. Is it right for the individual to be like God in this way, but then it's sinful for the church to be like God in this way? Of course, that question should become obvious in, is it sinful for the church to follow God's example? That should be obvious to all of us. You're saying that the church sins in following the example of God? And yet that's the position that must be held by the saints only brethren. Is it sinful for the church to love her enemies? Because Jesus in this context sets forth, you've heard that it's been said, love your enemies or hate your enemies. What? Must the church then hate the enemies? When he says, but I say unto you to love your enemies. But if it's sinful for the church to do these things, then it's sinful for the church to love its enemies. And in fact, in reality, you have to get back to the church must hate her enemies. So we as individuals must love our enemies, but if the church loves its enemies, it sins. Surely we can start seeing that both individual action and church action are involved in this. That both individual and the church are to love their enemies, to do good to them in order to be true children of God. But let's not stop there. Romans 5, verses 8 through verse 10. God commended his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled shall we be saved by his life. God's love, Paul writes, was extended to us when we were non-saints. When we were enemies, he says. That's a non-saint. God's nature is to be benevolent toward that non-saint, and that Christ died for it. In fact, God's grace is extended to all, not just saints. For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared unto all men, Paul writes Titus 2 and verse 11. To all men. Or should we read this, for the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all saints. If it's all men, then God's grace is being extended to non-saints, as well as those who accept God's grace and become a saint. Christ died for all individuals, not just saints. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. Now a Calvinist comes along and because of their view of limited atonement says that the grace of God should taste death for those who are elected by God to salvation. The saints only position must end up being that Christ tasted death for the saint. But in reality, it's for every man, saint or sinner, that Christ died for. He died for all men. But what about Jesus and his benevolent work? Consider the feeding of people that Jesus did. Two occasions that we'll mention. The feeding of the 5,000 men with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. This is recorded in all 4 accounts of the life of Christ. Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. Mark 6, 31 through 44. Luke 9, 12 through 17. And John 6, verses 1 through 14. In this account, notice it says 5,000 men. That's not including women, and children are specifically mentioned. In Matthew 14 and verse 21, they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Now realize that in Judaism they were a part of the covenant, but under the New Testament period, those children are not saints. And they ate. But it's interesting if you turn over to John's account in John 6. He reveals that most of these men were not true disciples. If you look at verse 26, he tells them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, you seek me not because you saw the miracles, but because you ate the loaves and were filled." They were not true saints. Jesus knew that. He knew that when he fed them. And you see at the end of that chapter of John 6, starting in verse 60 and going through verse 66, that the majority of those individuals left Christ. Non-saints. But then there's the feeding of the 4,000 men with 7 loaves and 2 fishes. It's recorded in Matthew and Mark. Matthew 15, verses 32 through verse 39, and Mark 8, 1 through 9. Matthew's account recorded that children ate also. So in his feeding of people, Jesus fed all of those individuals, whether man, woman, child, and even those who he knew were not true disciples. But there's another occasion that we need to consider when we're looking at Jesus in this, and that is the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. This is recorded for us, and for time's sake I'm not going to read these, but Matthew 15 verses 21 through verse 28, and then in Mark 7 verses 24 through verse 30. This Syrophoenician woman was not an Israelite, and thus was not a child of God. Jesus explicitly states that he was not sent to them. In fact, in Mark's account, Mark 7, specifically in verse 27, he states, "Let the children first be filled." Now, does that sound something familiar with, for example, let us do good unto all men, especially they of the household of faith? Let the children first be filled. And he says, "For it is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it unto dogs." Jesus, yes, called her a dog. Now then, many people have made a big deal over that as to it. The word literally means a small puppy, and, well, those who are not Jews were considered dogs. She was not a Jew. She was not a child of God. That's what Jesus is emphasizing. It's not right to take the miracles that I'm performing and to give it to you. But then, because she says, "Yes, Lord, yea, even the dogs eat under the table, eat of the children's crumb." And what does he do? He does a benevolent act toward that one who is a non-saint, non-Jew. He healed her daughter. He extended a benevolent act toward someone who is not an Israelite, and thus one who is non-saint. Let me end with some questions and implications of this doctrine. If the doctrine is true, and we've emphasized these things many times through these lessons, but if the doctrine is true of saints only, the church cannot give funds from its treasury to help a needy orphan child. The church cannot help an orphan, even if the money goes to the home of a church member, because it's going to help a non-saint. And so even though that non-saint might be in the home of a saint, because it's going to help the non-saint, it cannot be given to that church member even, and be consistent with their doctrine. The church, if you have a man and woman married, and one of them is a saint and one of them is a non-saint, the church, out of its treasury, could provide benevolent aid to the saint, but since the spouse is a non-saint, it could not be used to help that non-saint. And if it was, then the church has committed sin and going to hell. And if they had a starving infant in that home, it could not help that starving infant either, because you're helping a non-saint. And thus you would commit sin in doing so. But yes, the money could be used to help that spouse who was a saint, just none of the others in the home. Now then, they would say that they would provide it individually, that they would take it out of their own pocket and help. But what if other members of the congregation were in the same condition? And you've got money in the church treasury. To be consistent, they would have to let the non-saint spouse and all the children, babies, starve because they are non-saints. The church cannot provide shelter, clothing, blankets, or food for non-saints even during a natural disaster. An elder in a congregation who holds this doctrine during a debate was asked about this very subject, and he said, "Oh yes, we've opened the building during disasters to allow people to come in and stay." And it never had dawned on him that the church, out of its treasury then, was helping non-saints. But according to their view, it cannot be done. But also, the church could not even give away a Bible to a non-saint that was purchased out of the church treasury. So if the church bought a Bible, it could not give that Bible to this non-saint, because then you're providing benevolent aid to a non-saint. Nor could the church even provide baptismal garments for baptism if those garments were purchased out of the church treasury. You're providing a benevolent aid to them for clothing to get baptized in, but the person's non-saint, and thus you could not provide it. No amenities at the building, we emphasized this earlier, could be used by a non-saint, including the property and the building itself. Some have used this to show the extremity of this view, that if a young child were hit by a car in the parking lot of the church building, could someone use the church phone to call for medical assistance? And think of a time before cell phones existed. Could someone run inside the building, lift up the phone that was purchased by church funds, call for medical assistance on a line that is provided for by church funds, to call for an ambulance to come and help that small baby or small child? If you say that someone could do that, then you transgressed the saints' only view. A couple of questions in view of James 1:27. Is it sin for the church to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction? Now, we noted the one debate proposition in which he stated it was sinful for the church to practice pure and undefiled religion in helping widows and orphans in the manner of Mount Dora or such other organizations, even if they were done by Christians. Is it really a sin for the church to do that? But then, if you also run into the question, what about the church in Jerusalem? Acts the 6th chapter. Their widows were being neglected in the daily ministration. If it is a sin for the church to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, then didn't the church in Jerusalem commit sin in providing benevolent aid to the widows? In fact, weren't, as directed by the apostles, 7 men set out to do that daily ministration? And yet, if James 1:27 is individual action only and the church sins by doing it, then the church in Jerusalem sinned in doing so. But if James 1:27 is only individual action and it's sinful for the church to do such, then is it sinful for the church to take a widow into the number as directed by 1 Timothy 5 and verse 27, a widow who is a widow indeed? Because it would be sinful for the church to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. And yet you have Paul in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8 setting forth, here's the church taking widows indeed into the church number. Thus you have contradictory information if it is sinful for the church to practice James 1:27. As hopefully you can see, the saints-only doctrine is a doctrine that's just filled with a multitude of problems and inconsistencies. It's a doctrine that ends up being contrary to God and God's nature, because God was benevolent toward all men, not just those who are saints. If God, in reality, took a saints-only view, we would all be lost. There's not a person on earth that could ever be saved if God took a saints-only view. Now then, we do need to understand that if a congregation makes a congregational decision to only give to those individuals who are Christians, but they do not make this a law upon others and all other congregations, then that's their right, their option to do as an autonomous congregation. They have that right to make that decision among themselves. The difficulty comes is when they make this a law, a matter of doctrine, and state that congregations who decide to give in a benevolent way to a non-saint, that they're sin and that they're going to hell. That's where the problem resides. Again, a congregation has a right to make their own autonomous decision. But when they make it a law upon others, it is wrong and it is sinful and must be fought against. I'm thankful to God that He did not take a saints-only view. But His grace is extended to all men, and that Christ died for all men so that you and I could be saved. And that, yes, while we were enemies, God's love is extended to us and that Christ died for us. Now, we must obediently respond to that grace of God, that death of Christ, and appropriate the blood that He shed upon the cross for our sins. We do that upon our faith, we repent of our sins, we make a confession of our faith, and we're baptized in water for the forgiveness of our sins. And in doing so, we appropriate the grace of God and that blood that He shed. Thanks be to God for that unspeakable gift. And yes, thanks be to God that we can accept it. If you're not a Christian, we would encourage you to become such. If you need to respond to the invitation and being restored to faithfulness to Him, and we would encourage you to do that so that you can be saved, because God desires your salvation. If you need to come, do so as we stand and sing the invitation song.